Well, thank you all for coming out tonight. Delighted to see you here at George Washington's Presidential Library at Mount Vernon. I'm Doug Bradburn, the president and CEO of Mount Vernon, and we got a really special talk tonight. Now, I do want to mention an upcoming talk that I encourage you all to see us at December 15th. Book talk, Women in George Washington's World, a brand new book that came out this year. We're going to have multiple authors involved with the production of that book, including the editor, and I really hope to see you here. It'll be an exciting night. Of course, we particularly want to thank Ford Motor Company, which makes these talks possible. Next year will be the 100th anniversary of Henry Ford's visit to George Washington's Mount Vernon. He came here, he saw George Washington's home, he marveled in it, was inspired by the story of the father of our country. He actually was particularly enamored with the smoke jack in the kitchen, which is the particular contraption in there. As the heat rises, it spins a little fan, which turns the spit, which smokes the animal that people would then eat. And Henry Ford asked at the time, the resident superintendent of Mount Vernon, which is the predecessor of the president and CEO. There's been a lot of great inflation in titles around here. But essentially, I'm the resident and superintendent. I'm the 11th in Mount Vernon. And the one at the time sent Henry Ford the design of the smoke jack. And Henry Ford put it in his colonial village that he created there in Michigan itself. So since that visit, and Henry Ford decided that the mansion house was in need of some support, and he gave a fire wagon, a fire truck, fire engine to the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. And so for 100 years, we've had a philanthropic relationship with the Ford Motor Company. And they're the ones who make these book talks possible. They've been supporting them since 2014, basically within months of the opening of the library. So we're delighted you're here, and we thank Ford very much for that support. Now, let's get to the main event. We're going to have a really good conversation tonight. We have Dr. Ricardo A. Herrera, visiting professor of military history at the U.S. Army War College at Carlisle Barracks, Pennsylvania. Previously professor of military history at the School of Advanced Military Studies at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. He's also a veteran of the U.S. Army. He earned his MA and PhD from Marquette University. He's the author of For Liberty and the Republic, The American Citizen as Soldier, 1775 to 1861, and many, many other articles helping us understand the development of the United States military. He's worked on his new book while he was a member here of the Washington Library's fellow class of 2016, 2017. I remember he would be out there in the reading room working, and I would yell at him, faster, write faster. I want this book. I've been wanting this book for many, many, many years. And so I'm delighted tonight to welcome, and let's give him a big, warm Mount Vernon welcome to discuss his new book, Feeding Washington's Army, Surviving the Valley Forge Winter, 1778. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rick Herrera. Rick.
Okay, perfect. Great.
Thank you. We very much support C-SPAN being with us tonight to support this lecture, and that's the pause here to get the proper multiple mics going on so that they can hear us. And we've had C-SPAN up at the library for many, many years, and we're delighted always when they're here to extend the reach of the work that we do. So thank you all for your work as well, and welcome to the C-SPAN audience. We'll be enjoying this. Hopefully for years to come, Rick Herrera, and talking about feeding Washington's Army, surviving the Valley Forge winter of 1778. Uh, I'm really good. It's really good to see you again, Rick.
It is. It's been far too long. I was sharing with Doug earlier that having been a research fellow here at Mount Vernon, it was and remains one of the highlights of my career as a historian. When I came here, I was offered the opportunity to homestead, as it were, in one of the carrolls. I instead chose to be in the reading room, which can be a little bit noisy as Doug's bringing in various people to come and see things. But it's got these 6 beautiful Udon-inspired busts of Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Franklin, Hamilton, Madison. And it was as though they, along with Doug, were saying, write faster, get to it. It was a phenomenal experience just to be here, to be on the grounds, to live here at Mount Vernon for a month, and to work in the resources, and to work on something that was a labor of love. I have nothing but great memories of having been here.
We need to treat our historians with the same love and reverence we give to our celebrities in this nation. A ridiculous amount of attention at the Kardashians of the world. Rick's going to put out a fashion line soon, I'm sure. But now you say that your experience here was one of your favorite times ever. But I know for a fact that you, as a reserve officer, had an opportunity to do some work. I was looking at a beautiful map, a Blaskowitz map of New York from the 1770s, from the American Revolutionary War. That's a copy. And you told me about an research experience you had at Governor's Island. Tell us all of that. Share that anecdote
Sure.
of your research life.
Oh, it was great. Who here has been a graduate student?
Yes, many.
Okay,
Yeah.
so how many of you were actually wealthy? Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So,
Yeah.
as a grad student at Marquette University, I was doing research for my dissertation that eventually became my first book, For Liberty and the Republic. I was still an Army Reserve officer. I called up the folks at Governor's Island, which is off the southern tip of Manhattan. It's been a fortified position since about 1765.
That's right.
When I called up, they asked, well, what's your rank? I said, well, I'm a captain. So, fairly low in the officer ranks.
Army officer ranks.
But this was a Coast Guard station. They translated captain to the equivalent of an Army colonel. So I got a colonel's suite of rooms, the bachelor officers' quarters. And then when I asked, well, here, or I presented my credit card, they said, oh, we're in the process of shutting the base down, so we don't want to handle any cash. So for 3 weeks, I get to stay on Governor's Island with these gorgeous views of Manhattan. It was fantastic. So I was able to research and do all my stuff, and as a grad student, save some money.
There you go. Wow. You can thank the American people for that. That's fantastic.
Thank you all.
Wonderful anecdote. I love to hear it. All right, so let's get into it. Feeding Washington's Army. Why did you feel like this book needed to be written?
The book was, for a historian, it was a dream. It's something important that happened that nobody had really touched upon. If I can go back to some of the genesis, perhaps.
Yeah.
It started out as a teaching moment. So when I left civilian academia 16 and a half odd years ago and returned to the Army as a civilian, I joined the staff ride team. And so what I was doing was...
Yeah, so what is a staff ride? Let's pretend like I'm a child. Speak to me as if I'm a child. What is a staff ride?
Have you eaten your vegetables?
Every
No dessert. So
day.
a staff ride is a focused study of a battle or a campaign that takes place on the actual ground over which the actions took place. And so what we do is use...
Is this something that the American Army developed, or is this done the world over? I mean, is this...
It's not done by every branch. The U.S. Army stole the idea from the Germans about 1906, introduced it, and it flourished. It died off depending on wars, but it's continued though. And so
It's
most
part of an
schools-
officer training exercise.
It's actually part of soldier education, all ranks,
All right.
enlisted men and women, non-commissioned officers, but also I've led them for folks from USAID.
Yeah.
So an element of the State Department, done it for others as well. And
Yeah,
so-
no, they've developed certainly into like a general leadership training. You get business people doing staff
Absolutely.
rides and that sort of thing. But yeah, it's a unique kind of way.
They are. And so the battlefield, the campaign area, becomes your classroom. So you're walking Yorktown, you're walking Fredericksburg, you're walking the area of the Philadelphia campaign. It becomes your classroom, but it also becomes a primary document for you and your students to interrogate. And so you go to the different locations, or stands as the terminology is, and you talk about what the actors at that time knew at that time and discuss what were their options. Because history, as we know, is contingent. Nothing's inevitable until it finally is, and you have no other options. Washington discovered that during the Valley Forge encampment. And to try and understand the decision-making, the leadership, and a host of other things. They're also great for team building exercises. You get people away from the flagpole, people let their hair down, not that we have much, at least in my case, and they are able to really build some good bonds.
Yeah.
And so this came out of my building a Philadelphia campaign staff ride, and we get to Valley Forge.
Yeah, so that's the question. Like, what at Valley Forge? You're just at Valley Forge.
Valley Forge is largely it's static, or so we think. How do I introduce?
Yeah, so there's a general myth or understanding of Valley.
There is, and like all myths, there are kernels of truth, of course. How do I interject movement into this? Then I recalled some work that I'd read by Wayne Bodle in the Valley Forge Winter, standing at Anthony Wayne's statue by the Pennsylvania encampment.
How many people have been to Valley Forge? All right, so just describe where Valley Forge is relative to.
Yep. Valley Forge, about 16, 18 miles north of Philadelphia. It's on the Schuylkill River. It's within easy-ish striking distance of Philadelphia if you're George Washington, but it's far enough away to be inconvenient if you're General Sir William Howe holding the garrison at Philadelphia. It's a compromise as well. It's also an armed encampment, and something that I introduce or try and understand it is that it was a precursor to something that we've all encountered in the news, the forward operating base, something that we've seen in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yeah, that was interesting in the book that you consider it as a forward operating base more than some sort of permanent encampment.
Right. I mean, although it's something like the fourth largest city in North America when Washington marches in with the main army.
How large was his army that he took in there?
Oh gosh, it's about 12,000.
Why did he go there?
It's because of compromise, and like all compromises, nobody's happy. And so it satisfies military needs. It keeps the British on notice. The Continental Army is not about to surrender this valuable state of Pennsylvania. We're going to challenge you for it. It's also political, and political and military affairs are always together. They can't be separated.
All right, good. So, all right, let's hold that and go back again to there. You are leading a staff ride about the campaign. You're trying to figure out how to make it dynamic when you get to this place called Valley Forge. I think if you ask an informed American citizen about Valley Forge, they think about, well, that's where the army starved and somehow got through the winter.
Yeah,
it's a static story. Right?
It is.
They're there. They survive. It's the winter.
Sure, and
so what's the point of the staff ride there?
We go there. This is a culminating point, if you will, for this 3-day event.
Yeah.
How do we interject some movement? And it came through the Army's need to sustain itself. We know that the Army was suffering through the winter, although it wasn't the worst winter. Morristown was far worse.
They always say that when you visit there.
Year afterwards. But this is still a miserable place to be. The people are living in the middle of the Little Ice Age, and so that means severe climatic change, severe weather change. You've got freeze, thaw, rain cycles. You don't know what the weather's going to hold. Some mornings are wonderful, other mornings are miserable. You don't know what Mother Nature's going to bring you. So yeah, the winter, not very pleasant. How do we feed the Army? And this is something that had been haunting the Army from day one. When the Continental Congress adopted the New England militiamen besieging Boston on the 14th of June, 1775, which, by the way, is the Army's birthday. How do we sustain it? How do we feed it? How do we make sure that these soldiers can do what they need to do? Because of the way that Congress had constructed a system out of their fear of power vested in the military, they built a system that actually hampered the efficient running of it. And there were other factors as well. So there was the lacuna, there was the gap. How do I do this?
Yeah.
After doing the research, I recognized, well, there's an article in this. Knocked out an article on the big picture, focusing mostly on Nathaniel Greene, who commanded the initial column, and then Anthony Wayne, who commands the column that goes over into New Jersey. There was still enough material. You know what? There's room for another article. Then came one on Henry Lee and his part in the foraging expedition, the Grand Forage of 1778. You know how it goes. If you've got 2 chapters, you've got the beginnings of a book.
Yeah, and here's the book,
Yes.
Feeding Washington's Army. Well, fantastic. So, all right, well, let's start from the basics then. You have an 18th century army in North America. What do they eat?
According to Congress's regulations,
Right.
roughly a pound of meat, roughly a pound of bread, an ounce of butter, 6 ounces of peas or beans, a pint of milk, a quart of beer daily, and a few other odds and ends.
So there's a daytime ration that is regulated by the Continental Congress for what the Continental Army should be eating.
For what every soldier should receive. Officers, however, because of their rank, their station, because they often are expected to host junior officers, and this is particularly so with the colonels and the generals. It's part of the 18th century way of building the bonds between you and your subordinates. They get extra rations, but they also have servants, are expected to maintain them. But that's what's on paper. The reality, though, markedly different.
Right. So that's what's on paper. That's what they're saying they're getting daily. How is this delivered in a perfect world on paper? What's the plan? How does this stuff? Who's in charge of getting this stuff?
In a perfect world, the commissary general would oversee the purchases and also the distribution of foodstuffs for the army.
Is the commissary general a civilian or a military figure?
He's actually originally he is a military officer, then becomes a civilian, and there are various appointees to the office.
Okay.
And that office gets split up into the commissary general for purchases, and then the commissary general for issues. Many of these men have militia rank, so they're addressed out of courtesy by their ranks,
right,
which can sometimes confuse things.
What about quartermasters? Don't they exist? What are they?
They do. The quartermaster in European armies functions something akin to a modern day chief of staff. So he would oversee the functioning of the secretaries, but he would also go out or designate officers to ride ahead of the army, lay out the encampment, hence the quarters, designate which brigades or regiments would occupy which quarters. And so they're doing that, but they're also in charge of the physical supply of the army. So things like the transportation, overseeing food, not food, but clothing, uniform, weapons. And there are subordinate quartermasters beneath the quartermaster general.
Okay, so there is an apparatus theoretically in place. Washington's army, what are they doing in 1777 before they're going to have to enter winter quarters?
Sure. Well,
so where are they? What's been going on?
Sure. Let's back it up to
back it up.
Let's back it up.
Let's get to it.
1776.
What's going on?
1776.
Yes, I've heard about it. Yeah, American Declaration of Independence.
Yes.
Washington crosses the Delaware. He whoops them.
Well, first though, he's got to be chased across the Jerseys.
Oh God, are we going all the way back to this?
It is. I mean, the Continental Army. I know.
Mhm.
I'm not going back to when the Earth cooled.
Okay,
So I'm not.
yeah.
So I've
The
avoided
Continental
that.
Army has diminished. They've been chased out of New York,
And so we get
all the way across the
we then
Jersey.
get the 10 days.
Yeah.
First and second Trenton. We get
Crosses the
Princeton,
Delaware, whoops the Germans at Trenton,
causes
goes
the
back,
British to
crosses
withdraw,
again, whoops them again, goes around them,
and then
and
we
run
get,
around, attacks Princeton.
then
Yeah.
then we get General William Howe, who's talking to his brother,
The British.
Admiral. Yes. His campaign plan is to take the American capital by threatening Philadelphia. He hopes to bring Washington to battle and win a decisive clash, destroy the Continental Army, destroy the American push for independence.
It's a good plan. I like it.
It sounds good.
Hmm.
It's uncoordinated, though. Lord George Germain, the colonial secretary back in London, the distances preclude anything like the sort of control that's needed.
Mhm.
So we get John Burgoyne, who gets bagged on the 17th of October, 1777, at Saratoga.
Upstate New York.
Back it up, though, to August. British Army lands at Head of Elk, today Elkton, Maryland, just south of it. Soldiers need to recover. Washington meets them at first with the light infantry at the only battle that I know of in Delaware at Couch's Bridge. They fall back. Washington will then meet them on the 11th of September at Brandywine. Washington's defeated.
Washington's defending Philadelphia.
He's defending Philadelphia.
Howe's marching to Philadelphia.
He is.
He hits them here, he hits them there. He loses at Brandywine.
He does, but the amazing thing, despite the loss, there are these flashes of brilliance. Nathaniel Greene executes what we would call a giant L-shaped ambush. So basically the letter L, and as British troops coming over the hill, he opens fire on them with a full division, 2 brigades of Virginians, which forces the British back. The Army's able to retire in pretty good order. The soldiers are actually pretty proud of their performance.
Mm.
The problems are in the higher ranks of the officers. They're still learning their business. They fall back. We get the Battle of Paoli, Anthony Wayne embarrassed there by Charles Gray, No Flint Gray, as he gets called later on. Mm-hmm. The Battle of the Clouds on today's Immaculata College. Rain bursts out. The soldiers from both sides staring at each other because they've got damp powder. Do you want to charge downhill in mud? No. You want to charge uphill in mud? No. They stare at each other. They march away. No battle.
Yeah, it's a forfeit.
October of 1777. Washington, ever aggressive. I've got a chance. I'm going to attack Howe, try and drive him out of Philadelphia. The Battle of Germantown. Again, problems with the senior commanders, but also Washington's penchant for some complex plans. Still, the Army at the lower ranks, from really the colonels on down, acquit themselves well. Some of the generals do really well. The Army has learned how to fight. This
is your bias of being at the General Staff and Command College.
No.
Not the National War College.
No. Actually, I don't know if I can say this on C-SPAN when I commented to my seminar about and Go Seminar 7 about the Army in the War of 1812. It covered itself in turds. It was such a poorly run outfit.
All right. Okay. So there's really leadership failures at the top in these Germantown and Brandywine.
But
they don't stop Howe from getting to Philadelphia.
They don't. Howe holds Philadelphia. Washington, though, in December,
the Army's still
wants it. He does, and he sets up for another battle at White Marsh. Fortifies this chain of hills and invites Howe. Come out. Howe marches out, looks at them, and Howe has flashbacks to Bunker Hill.
Right.
I can't waste my soldiers' lives, he realizes. Some skirmishing off on Howe's left, the American right, and the British Army retires to Philadelphia. It's there that Washington starts to talk to his generals. What do we do next? And again, Washington's aggressiveness. He's seriously considering waging a winter campaign, but why not? Look what he'd done the year before. Trenton won.
Now he has a lot more people.
Princeton, but they're also more experienced. Mm-hmm. This is an army that's been blooded. It's got veterans within it. Washington, still learning, but he's much better than he was before. His generals do a series of councils of war, debate it, and they're talking about things like even the value of continental currency. If we succeed, then what? If we fail, then what? So really good probing questions and answers. Washington rides out to reconnoiter the British defenses. They're too damn strong.
Yeah, they know what they're doing.
Washington
yeah.
decides, after talking again to his generals, writing letters to the president of the Second Continental Congress, Henry Laurens, as well as the governors of Pennsylvania and New Jersey. Finally, he decides it's going to be Valley Forge. It's not the best place, or ideal place really, for feeding the army, but in terms of answering military, political needs, showing that the Continental Congress exists, buttressing the waning power of Pennsylvania's government, defending what he can of southeastern Pennsylvania, defending what he can of New Jersey, defending what he can of Delaware and Maryland. This is the place that is the answer.
Yeah, one of the things I think you make really clear here is whatever we think of the tactical weaknesses or challenges there, that the strategic choice of Valley Forge, for the reasons you laid out, are critical.
Absolutely.
The British have just essentially captured the capital
They have.
of this supposedly new independent nation.
They have.
Washington's army doesn't need to be 17 miles away, or do they?
I think they did. And
Yeah.
Washington recognized that. Washington, for all his faults as a tactician, and William Howe was his superior when it came to that, as a strategist, Washington was developing into a first-rate strategist. Did he have blinders on or fixations? Certainly. But he understood the nature of the war and what needed to be accomplished. He got the big picture better than perhaps any other general officer in that war.
I mean, one of the things that becomes clear is that when you think about the environs around Philadelphia and how you're going to ultimately, and we'll get into this, how you provision an army, there's a lot of people who aren't really fans of the American cause in that region.
There are actually a lot of people who aren't fans of anybody's cause.
Yeah.
And both armies refer to them as the disaffected. These are people who just want to be left alone. And who can blame them? Do you want an army marching near you? Think of an army in the 18th century. Think of an army today. It's a tremendous engine of destruction.
Let's think about the 18th century.
In the 18th century, you're a farmer. You've just put up new fences. Guess what? They're gone. They're going into firewood. Your orchards, they're picked clean. Your livestock, they're now filling the bellies of hungry soldiers. These engines of destruction, even if they're on your side, you really don't want them near you. But the army, though, because of people who don't support the American cause, people who are hostile to it, people who just want to be left alone by both armies, and other factors, the Continental Army at Valley Forge was starving amidst a land of plenty.
So here we are at 1778. You got a British army in Philadelphia. You got Washington's army at Valley Forge. How big are these armies? How many men?
Howe's got roughly 20, 30,000 soldiers.
Howe has 20 to 30,000 people.
Yes.
And what's the population of Philadelphia
Oh gosh.
before Howe?
That number escapes
It's like
me.
15 to 17,000. It's not. He's doubled the size of the city.
He has, although a number of people have left the city. But yes.
Yeah. So, and then Washington's army is roughly what?
Oh, he marches in with between 10 to 12,000. He's got about 10,000 there, though.
Okay, so how
Rough figure.
much food does it take to feed an army of 20,000 men?
Literally tons. The estimate is that it took something like a third of a ton of food to feed a single soldier over the course of a year.
Yeah.
So that's quite a bit.
So where's Howe getting his food?
Howe is getting most of his food shipped over from England and Ireland. He'd hoped originally, and indeed most British ministers and senior officers had believed they'd be able to subsist the army off the countryside. They didn't really recognize the nature of the revolution. They didn't recognize loyalties and so much more. So they too suffered, if you will. So they're getting most of their prepared provisions, salt beef, salt pork, hard baked biscuit, most of that coming from depots in England and in Ireland, but they're also going out foraging. And in fact, after White Marsh, the standoff in December of 1777, Howe's army spends most of its time foraging. So both armies competing for foodstuffs, food, but even firewood, forage for animals. Those become the contested grounds, if you will, the contested stuff of war. If I can get it before my enemy does, all the better for me, and it hurts him.
Yeah. So what the book plays out is this drama in which these two armies are sort of competing with this ever shrinking availability of food in this region. And so Washington's marching into Valley Forge in what, February of 1778?
Well, it's December 20th of 1777. He marches in.
Okay, so they're marching in. How are their provisions as they're marching in? Will they? What do they know about how long it will last them? What do they have?
There's one incident where barrels were opened up when the soldiers arrived in camp. In a couple of accounts that I've got in the book, some inspectors, some captains from the Massachusetts line, looked at the food for their soldiers, declared it unfit to eat. The beef had spoiled. In a lot of cases, contractors who were hauling these barrels of beef, and each wagon, a 4-horse wagon, pull about a ton of goods, so maybe 8 barrels. Many of the contractors would actually siphon liquid off the brine that kept the food preserved to lighten their loads, make their jobs easier. Sometimes the contractors would simply dump the barrels over the side. No real ability to control their behavior because these are civilians. They're not subject to military discipline. And so the soldiers suffer.
So they don't have enough food to last the winter. Everybody knows this.
No,
What are the consequences if they run out of food? What happens?
As Washington puts it, this is the fatal crisis. If my soldiers are not fed, and there are accounts, Albigence Waldo, for example, a surgeon in the Connecticut line, writes that soldiers would shout out at officers, "No food, no food, no meat, no meat, no soldier." So they're threatening their officers, feed us as you promised, or you're not going to have an army.
Yeah, so you're talking about mutinies. You're talking about the army disbanding entirely.
Yeah, these are Americans, actually. These are citizens who've signed on for a short term, and they're doing what citizens would do. They're protesting the fact that the Congress and the Army have not held up their parts of the enlistment contracts. They haven't forgotten that they're citizens first. This soldier stuff is what I do for just a few years. I'm going back home. So they can't be a citizen. But they are suffering because of this. If the Army's not fed, Washington fears we either have to go in further west into the country, perhaps to York, perhaps to Reading, where we can feed the Army much more easily. However, we surrender control. This sends the wrong political message.
Yeah.
This allows the British to expand their control. Or the soldiers may desert, and we no longer have an army.
So that's the strategic choice there. You want to be close to Philadelphia. You want to continue to assert the fiction that this is a country, a new nation that is defending its territory and not just abandon a whole region to the British.
Absolutely. The Army was the armed embodiment of the American people in revolution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So the book describes, how they deal with it. So I don't know if we want to go into grody detail, effort by effort, but it's not a passive effort. They're not sitting there waiting for Congress to send food or find food.
No.
What do they have to do ultimately?
Congress, as you know, votes Washington near dictatorial powers, but Washington, ever cognizant of people's rights and the need to gain the people's acquiescence, because this is a people's war. does not want to violate property rights.
Yeah. So so they're not just going to go out and start stealing food from everybody
But-
they can find.
But to give a couple of examples, when Nathaniel Greene, who, no offense to Hamilton fans, really was Washington's right-hand man, when he leads out the main column from the encampment, he's doing what Washington ordered at first, giving receipts to people whose goods he's impressed.
All right.
Go to camp, see a paymaster, will pay you back in Continental dollars. Recognize that they're not worth much, but it's a little something. Greene, though, early on, some of his men capture a couple of farmers trying to put goods in the British lines. It's February. The weather's cold. Greene, none of this. Orders that these men be stripped to the waists. The wrists are secured. Each one gets 100 lashes. He wants to send a message. Thou shalt not supply the British.
No.
As it moves on the next few days, people are starting to hide their goods. Greene, although a Quaker, understands the hard hand of war. He says, no more. Instead, he starts to have his men take some farmers hostage, but his men will also then go out, ferret the goods out, and if I have to do this, he writes Washington, nobody's getting anything. I hear their cries, and like Pharaoh, I harden my heart.
Mm.
So Greene is bringing the hard hand of war to Pennsylvania's disaffected. In another case, we see...
so Greene's a critical figure. And of course, one of his people, Anthony Wayne,
Sure.
is also part of this grand forage.
He is. He decides early on. Initially, Colonel Stewart was supposed to go across the Delaware. Instead, Greene realizes this is too important. I need to send Wayne. Wayne, contrary to his nickname, Mad Anthony, is anything but. Wayne's aggressive. He's thoughtful. He's a good battlefield commander, despite Paoli. Wayne leads a very small brigade, and boy, am I pumping that up by calling it a brigade. It's only about 300 guys.
Mm.
They cross the Delaware with the help of John Barry, who commands what remains of the Continental Navy.
Mm-hmm.
Says to Barry, and I think that every man has a 14-year-old boy in his heart, give us a box of matches and tell us set fire to something, we're on it.
Yeah, Barry burns all the
Exactly, and that's part of it.
The New Jersey shore,
right?
basically.
Burn it and distract the Royal
burn all the fodder on the New Jersey shore, burn it all.
Exactly.
And they enjoy.
Barry does great work with that. Wayne works his way through, and he works really well with the New Jersey militia, Colonel Ellis, and Wayne develops these great networks. In fact,
what's great about this book is the cast of characters is really not the ones we usually think about.
No, and it's while the book I'm talking about logistics.
Yeah,
it's really about maturation, Washington, the general, but also the development of a command team, the trust that goes up and down.
Yeah,
also
talk about trust. How important is trust in leadership situations in the American Army?
Trust is key. It was key then. It's key now. Subordinates have got to trust their superiors. Superiors have got to trust their subordinates. The boss cannot be at every place at every time. Washington understood that. That's why he selects Greene to do this. And Greene understands, as we would today say, his left and right limits. Go forth, do what you need to do. Greene keeps him informed of all his movements. Washington has no problems with that. Anthony Wayne does the same thing once he's across the river. Writes back to Washington, keeping him posted of what's going on.
Yeah, and you also he does that with Light Horse Harry Lee.
Oh yeah,
Little Captain Lee.
Lee is in my estimation, is in my estimation, probably the finest light cavalry officer of the war. Now there are others who are really fine. William Washington,
Colonel William Washington, down in the South Carolinas. Yeah.
Sure. You've also got John Graves Simcoe, who I'm sorry, fans of.
Isn't he British?
He is. He's
we're not talking about him. Come on. What are we doing?
I'm trying to give the other side.
What other side? We're all Americans here.
But he is
So there's some
great
fine light cavalry,
officer.
but yeah, Lee
does.
is exceptional.
Lee is
He's young when he's put
he's
on
young.
this.
He's only about 25.
Yeah.
But Washington's known him and his family for years.
Yeah.
They've got that close connection. So, and Washington, in one case, salutes him in orders to the army as my dear Lee. For Washington to be that familiar with a mere captain speaks volumes about the nature of their relationship.
Well, one of the things that struck me, which was so surprising about Lee as a captain, he's dealing with generals in the militia, and his orders basically to make them do what he wants them to do.
Well,
But he does it in such a way that they don't resent him, and he's able somehow also the population and the civilian authorities don't resent him. He very much somehow has that Washington magic.
He's Lee, although he's something of a hothead.
Yeah.
He was polished. His education at Princeton, his upbringing in Tidewater, Virginia, he understood how to work with elites. He also had, of course, Washington writing to them, letting folks like General Smallwood, who commands the Maryland division in Wilmington. Lee is coming down. He's doing the following for the army. Please give him all your assistance. And they understand that this struggle is not about me as Smallwood or whomever. It's about them. It's about other people.
Yeah.
Therefore, it's incumbent upon me to give Captain Lee as much assistance as I possibly can. And they do.
Yeah, it's extraordinary the way you bring out these stories that are pretty much unknown today. There's also places that take on a renewed significance, like the Head of Elk.
Oh, yeah. Head of Elk.
Anybody familiar with where we're talking about when I say the Head of Elk or Elkton, Maryland? Paint us a picture geographically.
Sure, you've got it's basically near some of the headwaters, if you will, of the Chesapeake Bay. It sits on a spit of land in Maryland. It had been a shipbuilding center, but also a transportation center, the Hollingsworth.
It's sort of like in between. There's Philadelphia and there's Baltimore, and there's the Head of Elk's kind of in the middle,
right,
near Wilmington. But where that big Delmarva Peninsula comes down, it kind of right in the middle of that.
It is, and
right at the top of the bay.
Roads, rivers. So you've got all transportation, and you've also got.
It's only about 40 miles from Valley Forge.
Right. It's
the crow flies.
It's a short transit.
Yeah.
For a fully loaded wagon, about 4 days.
But you can sail a naval ship kind of right into the.
You can get
harbor.
shallow draft ships up to that area. Yes, yeah. Absolutely.
And it's a critical sort of supply point for all this food stuff.
It is. It's one of the key magazines, supply depots in easier terminology. Throughout.
Why don't the British just seize it?
They did.
Well, why don't they stay there?
They don't have enough soldiers. Howe can only disperse so much combat power across the region.
Why? Why can't he put 100 people there? Hessians or somebody.
Think about what had happened a couple of years before. Think about what had happened at Trenton. And that was an entire brigade, some 1,500.
So because of that, there's a sense that the British need to keep their armies
concentrated.
Tight and concentrated.
Absolutely.
So they're not trying to occupy the countryside.
They realize that, in fact, when Howe is sending out his foraging expeditions while he's at Philadelphia, it's generally in brigade strength. So at least 2 to 3 battalions. So several hundred, a couple of thousand.
Yeah, they were
soldiers.
sending out like 500 men to chop wood.
Sometimes they're sending out upwards of half the army. Why? Because you've got soldiers who are actually doing the cutting, who are actually going out, gathering, visiting farms, but then they have a covering force.
They're functioning as an occupying force, but they're not as a governing force. They don't play that role.
The exercise of British power does not extend beyond the neck of the Philadelphia Peninsula.
Yeah, I mean, you do a very good job. I mean, you're drawing on work by John Shai and others about the role of the U.S. Continental Army and with the associated militias on sort of the maintenance of political power, which is one of the great weaknesses of the British situation.
It was, and
It's kind of counterintuitive. But
one of the things the British had suffered from, one of the many things, excuse me, was the poor knowledge of the population. They'd been getting reports 1774, even earlier on, about large numbers of loyalists.
Right.
All you need to do is show the king's standard. The people will rise up in defense of his majesty. They get there, and where are the people? I'm looking. I don't think I see you. And so, in part, it's because the loyalist populations were dispersed. In part, because the rebel militia served as a police force to maintain loyalty or at least submission to the American governments. A variety of things. They could never raise the loyalists much beyond the duration of the occupation of an area by British regulars.
It's really astonishing because it goes from being a British colony to all of a sudden the British Army is a foreign army in its own
Absolutely,
place.
absolutely, and there you see officers and others writing about the British myrmidons and this unnatural war.
Well, look, it's an incredible book, an examination of how that army, Washington's army, survives, its significance. Let's go ahead and open up to some questions from the audience. We can maybe tease out a few more of our incredible lessons we have to learn here. But what is, as we're moving the microphone around, we'll want you to wait because we have our good friends at C-SPAN. Wait for the mic, but as I'm seeing some hands hopefully pop up here, what was your takeaway about our George Washington? I mean, what did he show to you as you studied this Grand Forage, this effort to keep the Army alive at Valley Forge? What is the lesson you would tell people on that staff ride that you came to understand?
Yeah, there are any number of things, but I think for me, the key takeaway was Washington's ability to build a great command team through trust. He was able to earn, just because you've got all the stars, doesn't mean that people are going to trust you or respect you. Washington understood that he had to earn their trust and their respect, and it was paid back. And it was paid back in bushelfuls.
All right, well, let's get some questions here. I've got somebody in the back here. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Herrera, and I work for the Naval History and Heritage Command. I wanted to know what we're always interested in lessons learned, and we are currently working on something for the first foraging base in the Pacific in World War II. So I wanted to know to what degree something like this, that's in the 18th century, is useful as a tool even for today for current logistics issues across the services.
Great question.
Sure, and I will confess that I've known Dr. Haley since she was a graduate student, and it's always a delight to see someone like this doing so well. But for the Pacific campaigns, those were all about basing. The only reason that the Army and the Marine Corps existed in World War II in the Pacific was to land, seize islands that could then be turned into airfields, port facilities, logistical hubs for the American advance on Japan. They were there to secure ports, airfields, supply posts so that the Navy could continue its advance, so that aircraft could continue their advance upon Japan. Hence the significance of basing Head of Elk.
Yeah, so the Head of Elk story that he's talking about, I mean, they create that magazine. But also, I think Valley Forge itself, you think of as a forward operating base. It's not like some place they just hang out. It really is sending out missions to secure particular effects.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the Valley Forge was the home of an active field army doing the things that soldiers then and soldiers today would recognize. Washington had outposts 6 miles or so away. He had cavalry screens 6 or so miles away, all with the intention of giving him warning, ferreting out information about his enemy, but also launching patrols against his enemy. This is the home of an active army doing the stuff that soldiers recognized then and would recognize over 2 centuries later.
Mm-hmm. Right here.
So it was a Continental Army,
Yes, sir.
but each of the new states had regiments within this army, and they had responsibilities under the way the country was governed to provide pay and uniforms and supplies. How far afield did Washington's quartermasters actually have to go to get stuff? Did they get stuff from Georgia, the Carolinas, and bring it up somehow?
Good, yeah, good question. There's a, I recall reading a long time ago, perhaps the best supplied troops were those from Connecticut, the worst supplied from North Carolina. The states were responsible, and one of the things that you see in Washington's letters is he would at times take a senior officer from some state's line. So the lieutenant colonel of the 7th Maryland, whose name is escaping me now, please forgive me. Washington writes to the governor, writes to this lieutenant colonel, I need you to go down to Maryland, talk to your governor, and get supplies. You need to help me clothe your Maryland line. But Washington also has authority from Pennsylvania to impress blankets, shoes, leather, wool, linen, whatever he needs to supply the army. At the same time, because we don't want to make things more complex, because we have to make things more complex, he's also competing with purchasing agents from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and purchasing agents from the Commissariat of the Continental Army and the Quartermaster General's Office of the Continental Army. And then each state has its own purchasing agents, and they are trying to get all of these things. No centralized efficiency. It's a real challenge.
One of the things I think Rick also points out is there's a complete breakdown in the New England purchasing that happens for reasons that have nothing to do with what's actually going on. It has to do with politics.
Yeah.
And so the Army is particularly unprepared, and the country's unprepared to supply them at the time they're marching into Valley Forge.
Absolutely.
So yeah, there should be a lot of cattle coming from New England for this army, where there's plenty of cattle, but that all breaks down because the person in charge of it resigned, and then there was all sorts of malfeasance and corruption, and so you're dealing with all these challenges in the face of the war.
And also the fact that purchasing agents were required to give something like $5,000 bond, and
that's the problem, right? There's no money. The money's not worth anything.
No, and
if you're a purchasing agent, it's all on your own credit, and you can end up in jail if you can't pay everybody for all this stuff.
Sure. And you're hoping that Congress will pay you exactly what you put out.
Yeah, it's freedom. But freedom ain't free. All right, who had a question in the back?
It's actually kind of an extension.
Then I see one over here and then one here, Stephen. Go ahead. Sorry.
Kind of an extension of the quartermaster, and then where we're going with purchasing agents. I'm actually in contracting for the Air Force currently.
Thank you.
I was not picking on you, by the way.
Great to be part of it.
An airdrop.
Do
would be
we
nice.
see the early beginnings of seeing weaknesses in the way we equip and feed our troops? You know, kind of the antecedent of what our interesting, to put it mildly, acquisition system is today, and anything related to contracting of, don't pay above these prices, or the rules of doing business on behalf of General Washington.
Right. Congress had set forth prices. Here are the maximum amounts. Washington would also held at least a couple of times, for lack of a better term, a market at Valley Forge, urging farmers, come in, bring your goods. Here are the prices we're offering. And so, yeah, they will offer only so much. They can only afford so much. One of the problems with Continental script being so worthless is that the Congress had no taxing power. And so all this money going out and nobody taxing it, none of the states willing to tax to bring the money in and make it dearer, make it actually have some value perhaps. And so the inflationary pressures just to the moon.
Well, and you're competing with another army
Which
who's
has
playing in
specie.
species, playing in
It's
gold
got
and
gold and
silver.
silver, yeah.
So you're in the same region competing with this other army to purchase this stuff.
And if you're a farmer, you've got to look out for your family.
Yeah.
Okay, so I kind of like what the Americans are saying, but these redcoats have actually got cold hard cash.
And there's a
That's
lot of
worth something.
Quakers you can't trust. No offense. We love the Friends. There's a question over here.
Hi, I'm curious about two things. First, can you paint a picture of what it looked like when they all came back to camp? Was it like a cattle herd?
Yeah.
And wagons full of grain and things that they found. And then, is there any evidence that part of the sort of dysfunctionality that you mentioned was part of the cabal, part of the effort to take down Washington and to make him look bad?
Great question.
Yeah, the
Somebody here.
supplies flowed in, it really in dribs and drabs. That's a technical term. But you would get grain, for example. Hey, we've got X number of cattle. I've not been able to come across Green's records. In fact, the only records I've been able to come across that list who visited what and impressed what were Light Horse Harry Lee's, which are held at the Gloucester County Historical Society in New Jersey in the Hollingsworth papers. No, not Hollingsworth. Forgive, I lost that one. But so they're coming in at different rates, and so there's no real knowledge as to when wagons are going to come in, as to when cattle or sheep or swine will be driven in. It just depends. As far as the cabal, nothing really there, although Washington was certainly doing his best to, one, suppress his opponents, two, secure his own position, and three, enable the army to continue its fight.
Great question. Right here's another.
Thanks for coming down tonight. Good to see you again. So beans go hand in hand with bullets. So just out of curiosity, and if you can comment, did you find anything that talks about like the risk calculus or ammunition management while you're conducting an active defense when food's already a problem and you're conducting an active defense? Did you come across anything talking about how they did like ROE or engagement procedure, how they manage their ammunition stockpiles or included that in their foraging?
You know, and the lieutenant colonel who, as far as ROE, that means rules of engagement. There's nothing that I came across regarding that. And it may be that it was because I was so focused on the Army feeding itself and going through that I may have looked past that. That said, I know that there was enough ammunition, certainly at least with Nathaniel Green's foraging column, to engage in a firefight with Ansbachers, who held a redoubt that is today beneath the 30th Street train station in Philadelphia.
Yeah, no, I got the sense that there were instructions basically here not to.
Don't bring on a fight.
Yeah, don't bring on a fight. Keep the army alive. I mean, don't take unnecessary
Right.
risks. And also, how do you engage with civilians, right? I mean, they're really trying. Washington's instructions are really trying to treat everybody very civilly. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of challenges there, particularly with the disaffected.
Oh, absolutely.
But it's very different from the British, which just seem they're just going to take what they want.
The British would seize it, and you see accounts of.
So Washington's working under this conceit, and he's asking his officers to work under the conceit that we are the governing power of the country, and these are our citizens. Whereas the British are sort of like, we're just going to supply the army.
Well, and that's the British conceit.
Yeah.
Washington, however, understands that this was a struggle for people's affections and loyalty.
The hearts and minds.
Absolutely. At the top, let's get them to like us. Let's have people support us actively. At the bottom, the worst, they actively oppose us. They dislike us.
Yeah.
I'll take the middle ground. They don't hate us. They don't love us. They just leave us alone. So trying not to alienate people is the lowest thing that his soldiers can do.
But brutality towards deserters that are captured.
Deserters are another matter. You know, these are men who have signed on for a contract. You violate it, you're now subject to Army discipline. Welcome to the lash.
We have a question back, and then there's one in front. Please.
Civil War historian Kent Masterson Brown writes two terrific accounts recently. One was titled Lee's Retreat from Gettysburg and Meade at Gettysburg. And in those accounts, he discusses the nutritional needs and foraging needs of 60,000 horses and 40,000 mules. And apparently at that time, during the war, the government had specific requirements for these nutritional needs of the horses. They required roughly 14 pounds of oats a day and 14 pounds of grains a day. And, you know, to keep these horses in some form of condition to perform pulling wagons and caissons and so forth. Did Washington implement anything for the animals, for horses and so forth?
Yeah, there were actually several books published on, for example, the management of the light cavalry. One that comes to mind is by an author named Hinde, Hinde. But there are also various books on animal husbandry. Here's what you should feed cattle, sheep, swine at this time of year. Here's what you should feed them when you're getting them fattened for slaughter. Here's what horses need to eat. And so they do have this knowledge. Plus, keep in mind, this is an agricultural society. And so understanding animals' nutritional needs, I don't want to say is secondhand, but was something that was rather familiar for most soldiers. One of the things, though, that Washington
these officers aren't a bunch of knickerbockers. They're all farmers. I mean, they know what a horse needs.
They do. But Washington orders that superfluous horses be sent away from camp. So it's basically senior officers who have horses. They need to be mounted. There are enough horses for some of the artillery. Not enough horses, certainly, for the very few wagons that exist. The cavalry was dispersed so that it could feed off of parts of New Jersey, parts of Pennsylvania, and so that lessened the burden on the main army supplying the livestock.
Reading the book, I mean, you realize how distant we are from the world and the basic knowledge that these people had of how to manage animals, how to feed animals, how to move animals, how to move feed for animals, which animals you don't want to bring, which ones you do want to bring. I mean, it's really, you're very humbling. You're reading this and you're like, oh yeah. I mean, they're sending hundreds and hundreds of head of cattle into the camp, and it's like going to feed them for a day. You know,
Sure. And
what are we doing? I mean, where are these animals coming from?
And
they're all over the place.
And if this is livestock that's meant to feed the army, you don't want it to move too fast, too far, because what does it do? They lose weight.
It's got to be fattened.
No good to the soldiers who are going to eat them.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, great question here.
Yes, sir.
I have a bottom line question. My bottom line question is, to what degree did the need for foraging impair the fighting ability of Washington's army?
The need to sustain Washington's army, but also Howe's army, drove the nature of the combat actions that took place during the occupation of Philadelphia. Howe's soldiers spent most of their time foraging. British rule of thumb was to have 6 months of supply on hand at all times. There were only a couple of times during the 8 years of this war that ever took place. Both armies spent much of their time during this winter searching for food to feed themselves. That, however, was an act of war against the other. By seizing food and forage and denying it to my enemy, I therefore wage war against him in a different fashion. I don't have to line up and exchange volleys with my 69 caliber Charleville or my 75 caliber Brown Bess. Instead, I can deny him the stuff to fill soldiers' bellies.
If I was a Canadian and I'm reading this book, I'm like, why don't you just attack Washington and Valley Forge? There's there's no fighting generals there anymore. Half the people are out foraging the countryside. Go attack them.
Absolutely. And it's a great question. Several reasons. One, Howe has got most of the British Army in America. Most of Britain's regulars were in America. He's got to keep them there. He's got to keep them alive. Valley Forge was an armed camp. Fortifications guarding all of the major road approaches into camp. Redoubts, in other words, small forts scattered throughout the encampment. Mount Joy, which runs north to south against the parade ground. Entrenchments built on it. What Washington has got, thanks to his French engineers, in particular General Duportail, forgive my pronunciation,
Terrible.
was a defense in depth. There are no trees to obscure the fields of fire. All of their fields of fire, in other words, shooting at the enemy, are interlocking, creating kill zones. Very modern sounding, it goes way back. Washington's got all this. Howe recognizes, I can't risk my soldiers' lives in a fruitless mission. I remember Bunker Hill. I'm not about to do it again.
Yeah, the loss of one British soldier is a big, big deal. They're
It
not
is.
easy to be found again. Question over here.
Was food used as medical countermeasures back when they were in Valley Forge?
I'm sorry, you have to speak up.
Was food used as medical countermeasures back in Valley Forge? I mean, was there, since there was a lack of food, was there higher mortality rates within the brigade?
Yeah, I don't know about the mortality rate because of the lack of food. We do have, of course, the muster rolls and the count of soldiers who were there. I can tell you, though, something about some of the food that was brought. At one point, soldiers in Smallwood's command in Wilmington, Delaware, slaughtering fresh cattle. The cattle were immediately thrown, the carcasses were thrown into the Delaware River because apparently the cattle were dying on the hoof. It seems that they suffered from rinderpest and they were essentially, I almost tempted to call them zombies. These cattle had heartbeats, but they were dying and there was nothing healthy about them. So those were meals that soldiers did not have.
Any other questions? Thoughts, concerns? Well, I think this has been an extraordinary. Oh, I see one more. Let's have one more question here and then we'll wrap her up. He's on the other side of the show here. Okay. This is going to be a good one.
I just have a quick question. At the beginning, you talked a lot about how Valley Forge was not an ideal location, that was a compromise. In what would have been the ideal location? What would have been if political needs and what have you were put aside or what have you? What would have been the preference for being in camps?
You can't put aside political needs, and all war is political. War is a political instrument by the state, so can't even think about that. There's no such thing as pure military action devoid of politics. It depends on what you want, on what Washington wanted. If it was simply to sustain the army, falling back closer to Reading or York, further away from the British, would have made his life much easier. But there would have been the problem with surrendering that area to British control. and sending the wrong message to the American people, sending the wrong message to the British people and to the British Army. It's the best bad choice of all the choices available. And I think it was the right choice.
So why do you think, Rick, that Valley Forge still plays such a role in Americans' memory of the American Revolution itself? Even though winters at Morristown were in some ways harsher, more challenging. What is it about Valley Forge you think that's captured the imagination?
One, of course, Washington's there, but it happens during what seems to be the climactic year of the war, 1777. Here you've got a British army advancing southward from Canada under John Burgoyne, Howe's army advancing south and then north against Philadelphia. The American capital is captured. Washington's defeated at nearly every turn in the campaign. It says a lot to Americans. The winter itself, although not as harsh as we've discussed at Morristown, still a harsh one, but its proximity to Philadelphia and all of these events going on really come together to make it into the mythic thing that we know. But as with all myths, there are kernels of truth, and there's so much more to be learned than just by ennobling these soldiers into this Greek chorus of suffering.
Well, the Supply Corps of the U.S. Army should love this. It's all about. It definitely shows how supply wins wars, and it's critical. And really, Rick, you've given an incredible gift to our understanding of the American Revolutionary War and George Washington's development as a leader. I encourage everybody to get the book. I'll say that I read most of the book. I also listened to quite a bit of it on audio guide. The sad thing about your audio version is it's not you narrating it with this incredible voice you have, this great bass baritone Rick Herrera voice. So that's something we can ask his future publisher.
My editor pushed for it, but
I mean, listen to that. You know, that's what I was looking forward to, and I got some, Poindexter doing the thing. So everybody's got to buy a book. Rick will be here afterward to sign them. He'll stay here all night. He signs every book and every book of every friend. And of course, all the proceeds go to support the education mission here at Mount Vernon. Thank you to C-SPAN for being here tonight. Thank you all for being here. Let's give Rick a big round of applause. Rick Herrera. Wonderful stuff. Yeah, thank you. Beauty.